Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube. In this video, I'm going to be discussing Infinity EQ from Slate Digital. It's an EQ that's been out for a while, but they recently revamped it and they added the feature that everybody has been asking for, and that is dynamic EQ, equalization that reacts to program material. Now, there are some trade-offs when using dynamic EQ, so typically I try to avoid it, but when I need dynamic EQ, well, I need it, so I'm glad that they added this feature. But what is Infinity EQ? Well, in my mind, all equalizers fit into two distinct categories. We have our character EQs, and those are the ones that have a specific personality. They have a tone, a texture, a character that we're looking for. Neves and pull text come to mind. And the other category is utility EQs. These are the EQs that we reach for when we just need to get something very specific done, and they're all about versatility and workflow. I would put Infinity EQ squarely into that category. It's about being as transparent as possible while having the most versatility and also the best workflow, and I think it accomplishes it really, really well. So what I'm going to do is jump in here. I'm going to give you a before and after. This is a record for Akon's upcoming album. I'm going to give you a little sneak peek. I'm going to play it. I have my stems printed, and I feel like the mix is at like 90–95%. It's really good, but it's not 100% of the way there. Then I'm going to pull on Infinity EQ, and that's what's going to get it to 100%. And then we're going to walk through what I'm doing with Infinity EQ and some of the features that I think make it really stand out. So, okay, let's play this down a little bit.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
Okay, after.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
So I want to point out here that that change is not massive, but it is significant. More importantly, it's a change where we feel like everything has improved, but I don't feel like I'm hearing everything being EQ'd. And that's really, really important. We want transparency, and I think for what Infinity EQ can do, which is some pretty crazy extreme curves and slopes and utilities and things like that, it leaves a very transparent mark. There's not much that it imparts in terms of its own sound, which is exactly what we want from this kind of an EQ. And I think it's one of the things that makes Infinity EQ one of the most competitive, if not the most competitive. So, okay, let's walk through some of this stuff. Let's start here with probably the biggest change, which is going to be our chant, which leads in the record here. Without it, it's a little small sounding. With it, it gets much bigger. So what are we doing here? Well, the first thing I'm doing is a very, very broad, even boost. So I've got my slope here as wide as it can go, or I'm sorry, I've got my Q here as wide as it can go. And I've got my slope for my curves pretty tight, which is one of the things that's kind of cool about Infinity EQ. If I hold down Shift and I just roll my jog wheel here, I can make the slope tighter or looser. And I found right here felt really, really even across the entire band, which is pretty much the whole spectrum of frequency content for this sound. Now, what makes this really, really neat is that I have a slide wheel, and I think this is such a cool and smart feature. I have a slide wheel that allows me to set a percentage of how much mid versus side I want to increase. So here, what I'm basically doing is pulling up all of the side information, which I think is really, really neat. But if I wanted to do something totally crazy, I could actually stretch the mid information into the sides using the same slider. So instead of doing just like side here, so this would be like, this is a 540 hertz boost at the sides only, I could actually start pushing this further, and what I'm doing is now cutting mids. So I'm pulling mids out of the same frequency while pushing it into the side frequency, right? I think that's really, really neat. That's super useful because it allows me to stretch a sound out of the center if I need to make room for something else. So I think whoever thought of that that was a brilliant decision, and it's definitely a cool, unique feature of this EQ. So other than that, we've got a few other things here. I wanted to make the overall chant feel a little bit more present and brighter, a little bit less back of jaw sound. And what I'm doing here is pushing up the signal, but I'm also using the dynamic feature to control it. So I've got it in automatic mode, and I've got the target down here at around 0, so that whenever it gets brighter than intended, it's going to pull the signal down. So it's just intelligently figuring out where I need that boost versus where I don't, because it's such dynamic material in that range. And then otherwise, I'm just doing a little bit of a high-end boost right here. Let's go here and get rid of this band real quick. So this is probably the most distinct change. I would say the next most distinct change is going to be within the sub bass here. So I've got my drum pattern and I've got my sub bass. And what I'm doing is using the drums as a sidechain. You can see I have this little key here, drum sidechain. And I've got this band here, which is in dynamic mode, but it is reacting to EXT, the external sidechain. So what I'm doing is in the sub bass, I am ducking the kick and actually the bottom end of the snare as well. So this is going to allow for a little bit more of the sub of the kick to just kind of breathe through. It's not a tremendous difference. It's only about 3 dB, but it's enough just to let the attack of the kick be a little bit more defined in the mix. Otherwise, not too different. It's in the deep lows, so it's not the most apparent thing in the world, and it's happening very fast. You can see I've moved my dynamic time constant. It's on tight, and I've moved it to 63%, which is pretty darn quick. So it's really just ducking the attack of the kick drum. This is a nice way where when you have a kick drum that's not contributing rhythmically to a record, to make a little bit of space for a component like a kick drum or snare drum that is rhythmically contributing to the record. Now, what this bass is doing is it's adding some substance in the lows. It's adding some texture and some character and some weight to the record, and I like that. So what I'm also doing here is a boost above the fundamental frequency, the stuff that's not where the kick drum is. I'm pulling up all those kind of like brassy harmonics. And I'm using this mid-side slider just a little bit to give me a little bit more emphasis on the side information than on the mid information. And so what that's going to do is it's going to expand the sides in addition to add that harmonic texture and tone. So it's widening the sound a little bit in addition to brightening the sound. So again, this mid-slider thing, mid-side slider thing, really, really cool. So let's play without. And with. I'm going to do it one more time, and I want to emphasize this point. The difference is not in the bass. You actually want to listen to the kick drum. That's the secret to hearing this correctly. So without. With. So we get just a little bit more size out of the overall sound, and we get a little bit more definition of the kick drum. So that's wins across the board. Now, what I'm doing here on this is pretty simple. The shaker, where the shaker meets the snare, it sounds good in solo. Like it feels like I got it right just where it was living by itself. But when we hear it in context of the overall record, it kind of gets in the way of the vocal ever so slightly. It starts to push a little bit too much energy into that upper mid area where it starts to sound a little harsh.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain cause it could.
And then in addition to that, I just feel like that range of the kick drum that steps above the speakers, the stuff that's between like 100 and 200 hertz, just feels like it's a little underrepresented. It's a little too smooth. So I'm also adding a little bit of bump in the lows. So a little more kick and a little bit less of that energy right where the shaker is meeting the snare.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
And again, the key to this is not really to listen to the drums, it's actually to listen to the vocal. So I'll do it one more time and keep that in mind.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to. Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to.
So the vocal sticks out just a little bit clearer. And if you're ever asking yourself that question, like how do you get a record to be so loud without losing the dynamics and things like that, this is kind of how you do it. You make other things appear big by giving them their correct space. So in this particular case, Khan's voice has a lot of presence in the upper mids, and we're going to talk about that right now because I think one of the other really big differences that we're getting here is the contouring of Khan's vocal, which definitely is a little tricky. If you've heard Khan's voice, you know that he has a very, very specific sound. He pushes a lot of energy into his upper mids. It's kind of his signature thing, and you got to work that really carefully because if you take it away, then he loses his character, but if you leave too much in there, he can be overly bright or aggressive. So here is his before.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
And in the context of the record, you'll hear that it sounds good, but maybe a little overly brassy and a little bit thin.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
Not bad, and I will say this, that sound is very good for very dense EDM records, but for something that's a little bit smoother and more open like this, I think a slightly warmer tone is good. So the question is, how do we get a warmer tone without losing the excitement and the energy? Now I'll play the after.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
So to help visualize this, and I am a little cautious about recommending analyzers, but I will say that when we need them, they can be useful. But you know what? Let's do a quick little aside about analyzers, especially with Infinity EQ, because the analyzers are really, really good and really specific and accurate, which actually can be a bit of a trap if we're not careful. But when we're using an analyzer, we always do an ear sandwich. Ears, analyzer, ears. And what that means is we have to hear something before we start doing something. If we don't hear something and an analyzer tells us something and we react to that, we're making a mistake. You always want your ear to say, oh, I feel like this sounds a little thin and maybe a little brassy. Okay, so my ear's telling me something. Then the analyzer can give me a little bit more information. In this particular case, I'm going to take out the real-time analyzer. I'm just going to use the average analyzer. And I'm going to bypass these two real quick.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like.
So our analyzer is telling us that right here at basically 4K, but like 4.12K, and then also right here at 8.8K, we have two little frequency buildup areas that are kind of making things harsh. Now that's what the analyzer is telling us, but ears, analyzer, ears, we always want to check to make sure that what we do correlates with what we're trying to hear. So just because I'm seeing something doesn't mean that I should be relying solely on that. So now I'm going to pull that in. You can see that on the analyzer, this is ducked down. It's kind of formed almost like a little slopey thing here, right? And I'm going to duck that down as well. Now I'm going to play it again. Do my ears tell me that this was correct?
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
Absolutely. Smoothed it out very transparently, gave it a great round, warm feel. What's the rest of the equation here? Well, we've pulled down these two narrow little bits in the upper mids, which has made the whole thing feel a little bit smoother, which is good, but I kind of want that presence to be there as well, so I'm using a broader slope to lift the entire range up. So the two little bits of the range that have some frequency buildup, I'm pulling those down. Those are narrower reductions, and then I'm pushing the whole thing, that whole broader range, up a little bit, so I'm brightening and darkening the voice at the same time, but I'm doing it in a very specific way, and this allows me to get a voice that's both warm, round, and present. So that's some secret sauce right there. I don't know if it's secret sauce or just good technique, but good technique, I think, is the best secret sauce. So lifting up just a little bit here, like a dB and a half, as a broad slope. Now I'm also using this in dynamic mode because sometimes there's extra sibilant energy that's showing up, and so I'm controlling it using dynamic mode here and just using the basic defaults more or less, type mode, 100% time, and then just setting the threshold where it makes sense. Same thing going on in the lows. I'm using a little bit of dynamic EQ. I'm doing a 1.5 dB boost, and then I'm using the smooth control with the time slightly slowed down just for the few little spots where the vocal kind of gets a little bit muddier. Vocals tend to be very dynamic in terms of frequency stuff because people move around the microphone. Sometimes people just change the way they're using their voice. And so there's a lot of dynamic stuff. We don't want to kill that stuff, but we do want to control it. So that becomes the entire equation here.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
Okay, so here, instead of showing what I'm doing on the pad, I'm going to recreate some ideas real quick, just to kind of demonstrate the EQ. So I want this pad to be really out of the center, really wide, and I want to give it some presence. I think that's what I want to do here for this demonstration. So, okay, first thing is when I pull up the Infinity EQ, anywhere I move this, it gives me a smart curve detector, I guess. So like if I go down here, it's saying, oh, you probably want a high pass. If I go over here, it says, oh, you probably want a low pass. If I'm anywhere in here, it says, okay, you're probably looking for a bell. But if I start getting around, 100 hertz or less, that says, okay, maybe you're looking for a shelf, right? So kind of smart, figures out what we want. In this particular case, I'm going to go for a mid band, and it defaults to this 2-octave Q, I believe. Something like that. If I just rotate the jog wheel, I can narrow or extend the Q. And if I hold shift while I do it, then I change the slope of the band. So what I'm going to do here is use my headphone thing to listen. So I want to take all these colorful textures here, and I want to put them in the sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip over here, and what I want to do is I want to stretch this signal out. So I'm going to push this only in the sides here. Yeah, let's do only in the sides here. And let's just bring up the side information. Nice. Now down here, I kind of want to do the opposite. I think what I want to do is I want to pull some of the lows out of the mids so I leave a little bit more room for the drums. So let's switch this over to mid. And now that I'm thinking about it, it would be nice maybe to even have the sides build up with some of that energy as well. So I'm going to push this a little bit further past the mid, and this is actually going to allow me to go from stereo to mid to pushing the side. So let's do that. Let's do that in a full sweep. So now we have this crazy, crazy wide signal. Of course, let's always check it in mono, right? There's like no low mids left in the mid channel. So in mono, we definitely are not going to have that mid information. Fortunately, we don't really need it because we've got everything else already there. I mean, to be honest, this is probably too much, but it's for demonstration purposes, so we're just going to roll with it. Now, let's hear how that sounds before and after in context.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse. Been a long road, but I came too far, I can't reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
So in stereo, that's a really, really cool configuration because it's now getting everything out of the way. It's like completely clarifying the middle, while at the same time, it's actually pushing the pad up in level if we're listening in stereo. Now, again, this is not going to fold to mono correctly because I'm doing something that's, pretty over the top here. What I actually ended up doing much subtler. I'm just taking out some lows and some highs. That's all that I felt that the sound really actually needed. And that's just to kind of make a little bit of room for the bass, kick, log drums, and then also make a little bit of room for the shaker and vocal.
Been a long road, but I came too far, I came reverse. I never like to complain, cause it could be worse.
So that's a look into Infinity EQ. Now, I know in the comments section, there's going to be the inevitable questions. What do you think of the Kirchhoff EQ? What do you think of the FabFilter Pro Q3? And I think those are both great EQs. I use the FabFilter Pro Q3 pretty often. I think Infinity EQ might replace it in the workflow, but it's a great plugin. You know, it's very, very hard to say one's better or worse. I will say that when I use FabFilter, I do feel like I hear the actual EQ, but part of that is probably because I've been using it for so long. Like I hear the sound of the EQ. And I will say that when it comes to removing very narrow resonances, I think that Infinity EQ is ultimately the best of the three. Kirchhoff, I do appreciate that in the dynamic section of the Kirchhoff EQ, you can pull a dynamic section down lower than the lower than the threshold in which you're setting it. I think that that's a really cool feature. What I don't like about Kirchhoff EQ, and this is a minor thing that doesn't necessarily impact me, but it's something that I feel like is worth kind of warning about. The slopes don't accurately represent what they're doing on the graph, particularly when you're using pass filters. If you use like a very, very steep pass filter, which is almost always not what you really want to be doing, it draws a hard cut and does not show any kind of resonant bump, but you definitely get a distinct resonance bump. Whereas with Infinity EQ, you get a fairly good graphic representation of what that resonance bump would look like, and you can also adjust it, which I think is really, really cool. Like if I wanted to go in here and I wanted to, say, do a resonant bump here, I can make this steeper or narrower, whatever I want to do. And as I start making it a harder slope, the resonance gets reflected and I can still adjust that. So this is why it's called Infinity EQ. It uses some algorithm to like even this stuff out and everything like that. So I have a very, very strong control over the resonances that I've got within the EQ. And I do think that that's really cool as well. But all three plugins are great. And I think it ultimately comes down to familiarity, like how quickly you can get around using the plugin, because that's ultimately what I think workflow is about. So anyway, those are my thoughts. If you have other thoughts, jump on in that comment section. If you're an Infinity EQ user and you're happy about the dynamics, or there's something that you're doing with it that's particularly unique, jump in the comment section below. If you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.